Historically, foreign correspondents haven't been the type of journalists who break major news stories in the countries they cover. That's because they're typically not as well sourced as the local reporters who grew up in a particular region and have an intimate knowledge of its issues. But what would happen if you could take the work of local reporters and translate it for English-speaking readers? That's the idea behind Worldcrunch, a media outlet that was founded in 2011. Rather than creating all of its own content, it syndicates articles from publications all around the world and then pays translators to adapt those articles for a Western audience. In a recent interview, founder Jeff Israely talked about his years of work as a foreign correspondent for Time magazine and how that fueled the idea for Worldcrunch. He also discussed the publication's evolving business model as it moved from syndication to advertising and subscriptions. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's jump into my interview with Jeff. Hey, Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about a media company that you currently run, but let's talk a little bit about what kind of led up to it and where you got the idea. So you spent a huge chunk of your career as a foreign correspondent. Where did you report and where did you work?
Well, originally I started my career actually in the States, in California, at dailies in the Bay Area. The last one was the Oakland Tribune. Then I ended up in Europe, in Rome, and worked for the AP, and then for about 10 years for Time magazine from Rome and Paris. And in my travels, also in sort of my colleagues, my Italian colleagues and French colleagues, and seeing the news offerings in French and Italian, there was this one magazine format, weekly magazine, and I was working for Time. I was working for a weekly, but there was a weekly in France and in Italy that basically translated stories from all over the world into their respective languages. The one in France started first by now about 25, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, called Corriere Internazionale. And in Rome, in Italy, there's a weekly there called Internazionale, and I was actually friends with the founders there, and so that's where the idea was from. It's as many ideas that may seem new, they're actually not new. They're sort of taken from somewhere and transformed in some way, and so.
So when someone becomes like a foreign correspondent, especially historically before kind of the current internet age, you didn't have to have some kind of special background. I was just talking to an editor at the Financial Times on this podcast who was like stationed in like China, and he didn't know Mandarin before going in. The Financial Times paid for him to receive Mandarin lessons and stuff like that. So like you going to Rome or Rome or France or something for Time magazine or the AP, it's not like you had some kind of special understanding of these countries, right?
I'll give you some personal background. I ended up in Rome because my wife was from Rome. She and I met in California, and so we basically decided to start our lives together. After meeting in California, we decided to set up shop in Rome, where she's from. And so I left my job at the Oakland Tribune and moved to Italy without the language and without any experience as a foreign correspondent. And so to start writing stories from abroad, actually the language is the real, I had at that point 6 or 7 years of daily newspaper experience. So the idea of a foreign correspondent, you're just really a reporter whose beat is abroad, and in this case the beat was sort of general news, and so, but the language is very important. I didn't have anyone, I had to learn the language on my own, and learned it fairly quickly because I was married into it. But yeah, in the sort of traditional sense, in the old model, foreign correspondence, it still exists to some extent. move from country to country and don't necessarily have the language, or even sometimes ever really learn the language of the place they're covering, and they're leaning on translators and fixers and whatnot. For me, I was going solo, but then started up with the AP, and by then, I had the language, and then had support, and um, but yeah,
And
but,
even
yeah.
and even if you know the language, you're still most foreign correspondents are heavily, unless they're actually native to that country and have grown up reporting there, they're leaning heavily on local correspondents to kind of lead the way, and they're kind of picking the best stories and maybe re-reporting them or maybe expanding on them or something like that in a lot of instances, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think even to this day, the way that a foreign correspondent's day starts is by reading the press in the country that they're following, and that's what I did. Back in the old days, I would buy six dailies and skim through them and listen to the radio, and yeah, you're covering an entire country, and across every, if you're a general news reporter, across every topic. So the starting point is what's being reported by the hundreds of reporters uh, from that country in that language. And so, but you've got to kind of weed past maybe the political bickering that's dominating the front page, and look for the story that's either a great story in and of itself, or somehow helps explain a topic that's important in a different way. And you may, like any reporter, you may come up with a story idea just by, as an editor once told me, sort of change the way you change your commute, change the way you walk to the grocery store, and you might notice something new. And so all of those sort of basic dictums of being a reporter and looking for stories apply for a foreign correspondent, with the one caveat that you know you're sort of you're really looking to sort of cross the borders and look for the stories that are happening in the country that you're covering, that have some relevance outside of the country, and to a global reader, or to a reader wherever your readership is. And so yeah, so it's the learning to be a foreign correspondent for a reporter who's already got a few years of experience under their belt. It comes pretty intuitively. Then there's the sort of the rocky parts of the language, all the rocky parts about living in a new country, and learning to get around and deal with the bureaucracy, deal with the codes of the way people talk and what things mean. But you're looking for great stories. You're looking for stories that matter. You're looking to explain. You have a little bit more knowledge than your readers, and you're trying to figure out how to impart that to them. And so the same
And
rules apply.
And in the pre-internet age, it wasn't really that big a deal that foreign correspondents weren't like breaking news or on the front lines necessarily, because you didn't have any competition, because you were just translating it for an American audience, like Time Magazine's audience. So it's not like Time Magazine was competing with these local outlets in any way, because the average American would not have even had access to those local outlets. But now obviously we live in an age where competition is just a single click away, and that kind of eroded the news weekly's role. That's why you saw the decline of like Newsweek, Time Magazine, U.S. News, and World Report. Whereas before, like the insight that Henry Luce, when he founded Time Magazine, was not everybody would be able to read every single newspaper, so he could take the best from every single one and compile it in a single place and just summarize it. So that's leading into your insight. As a foreign correspondent, you leave Time Magazine in like what, 2010, 2011.
Yep. Yep.
and you launched this site called, or this business called Worldcrunch. Tell me what happened in the lead up to the launch, like how it kind of solidified in your head, how the model would work, stuff like that.
Sure. Well, as I was saying before, the model for what Worldcrunch became already existed in Italy and in France. Uh, there used to be, I'm not sure if there still is, a weekly, or it may even be a monthly in Japan that does the same thing, which is essentially to look for stories, not just for looking for ideas and looking to get informed the way a foreign correspondent does, but to actually look for stories to translate in their entirety, and to, in their cases, turn out a weekly magazine from that. And so it was an idea that caught my attention when I first learned about it, um, and um, and nothing like that existed in English, and you know but it was at that point 2011, and so the idea of launching a weekly, particularly a weekly that would have a global readership, and print weekly, didn't make any sense, and it was the moment. It still is the moment to think digitally, and so basically took that concept of translating the world's best press, and covering the world in this kind of global way, and doing it online and in English, and that's what Worldcrunch set out to do. And yeah, and then we were faced. We were a small
So,
team. Yeah.
so I can. So the insight was, rather than launching a publication where you're hiring all these super expensive correspondents all around the world who are gonna maybe do subpar work compared to what the local press is doing, instead the insight was you will partner with the local press who has like the most experience, most knowledge, most on the ground sources, and you will translate, you will pick and choose what you think is relevant to a global audience or a western audience maybe, and translate those articles not just into English but also add in a little bit of extra context so that the western audience understands the global implications of those stories. Is that kind of it in a
That
nutshell?
that's it, exactly. With the idea, as we saw in these weeklies that existed in France and Italy. On the one hand, there was an economic rationale, that you simply the challenge was to find stories, to obtain the licensing rights to translate and publish them, and then figure out how to select the stories and how to then translate them and edit them and adapt them, for, in our case, a global audience reading in English. And so it was a cost saving way to cover the world, at a moment when foreign bureaus were closing, when all news organizations, and the news industry as a whole knew that costs had to come down. And at the same time, we saw and see a value in the final product itself. And it's not to take anything away from my foreign correspondent colleagues, and that's what I did for a long time. And there are certain times and certain stories that you really can't rely on the local reporter to tell the story for an international audience. Sometimes foreign correspondents do have a role, for interpreting what's happening in the place, but there's a real value in hearing the stories from where they're happening, told by the people who know the topic the best and who have the best access, and put together. What you end up with, the product as a whole, is a global view of the world, and the reader, of our website, and in Italy and France of theirs, is reading, is getting global coverage from a global perspective. And so it was both the structure and the economics and the practical matters, and because we thought that this way of covering the world, this way of explaining the world, and of finding stories was had a value in and of itself.
So you launched in 2011. You start approaching all these news outlets across the world. What was your pitch to them? Like, what did you bring to the table? They have all this valuable IP. Lots of media companies don't give up their IP very easily. So what was your approach to pitching them?
Well, yeah, it was. It was a particular moment in terms of you know just in general, if you find the right person inside a news organization who's looking to do new things and to innovate, we were we were a new company doing this new thing, but the basic idea, going into English as opposed in the other directions, is that it's a way to get your best. There were various parts of it, but the first part was, get your best work, reach more readers, to start with. Reach more readers. You multiply your reach by getting into English, and in English then is often the lingua franca to the gateway to other languages and other audiences. But we had a partnership that was based around the idea that we asked for the right to translate their stories. We limited it in most cases. We weren't going to go much beyond that to a few articles a week from each publication. So it was just going to be a sampling of your stories that we would select and that we would translate and adapt and make accessible at no cost to you. And then the original sort of revenue model that we launched with was that we were going to syndicate our news bundle to other media in the world, both other English media, but then again also in whatever language, because we could get it from all of these languages into English, and then they could take it and go into their language. And so we said to these prospective source partners that there'll be a revenue share on any syndication earnings that we have. And
Yeah, so you go and charge the New York Times $1,000 to syndicate some article, and they get 200 of it or something like that.
yeah. I mean, it was 50-50, and
yeah, oh, 50-50.
yeah,
Okay.
and we knew at the time that it was a sort of we thought of it as a kind of a bridge, a way to start earning some revenue, some real revenue, dollars as opposed to pennies and nickels, with a small team, and that was the original model for us to get some revenue, and also for us to bring in these source partners. But and everyone had a different reason for saying yes, and most said yes. If you got in touch with the right person, the spirit was, and I think still is, that if you're a real news people coming to other news people with a model for reaching more readers.
And so, like, how did you start building out a network of like translators, and how did you hire them at first? Because like it's a kind of the chicken or the egg thing. You needed money in order to hire the translators, in order to make the revenue so you could pay the translators. Did you have to like raise money first?
Yeah, we went out and we raised a bit of money,
Mm-hmm.
just enough to sort of cover the minimum cost, get a website built, and have a bit of a budget for translators. And and I was doing some of the translating at the beginning as well, but I was mostly doing the editing of the pieces that came in. But yeah, we have over the years paid people by the piece, sort of translation rates, and then slowly over time built up a small news desk, and tend to be people. We we get people who obviously have at least one other language, but it's obviously crucial that we have a fixed number of people who are native English, because we really it's crucial for us that the stories read really cleanly, and so you're the folks out there who are, we always say that our team is are multilingual journalists as opposed to pure translators. But with that said, we do have some people who are pure translators, and there's a sort of a method to it where the copy that comes in from them maybe gets a little bit of extra attention from an editor who will put in the next necessary context, or we'll send the pieces to them that we know don't really need the context. For example, if we translate a story from a foreign correspondent, let's say from one of our big European partners, and their correspondent in Beijing has a great reportage. That story, in German, written for a German audience, is essentially the same article that a Guardian correspondent or a New York Times correspondent in Beijing would send as well. And you don't need any adaptation or extra context if the German reporter is writing a good story. So you can send a story like that to just a professional translator. But a lot of stories need some context, and a journalist who has language skills knows where those holes are.
And obviously, you speak Italian, maybe French, but you don't speak a lot of other languages. How do you kind of, in terms of like the day to day editorial choices and stuff like that? Or do you rely heavily on your translators to pitch you local stories, and like how does that kind
Yeah.
of framework work?
Well, yeah. I mean, if it's a trusted colleague who says this this Spanish story or this Brazilian story is a great story on X or Y topic that interests us. We trust them that the story is worth doing, and we'll give it a green light, and voila. But if more and more, I'm realizing how useful it is also to, even if it's a trusted colleague, it might be worth me clicking on the link in the language I don't speak, and take a peek at it in Google Translate,
Yeah.
just to get a feel for the structure of the story and the content of the story. Are there quotes? I mean, as you know, Google Translate it does a pretty good job of giving you a feel for what's in a story. And then there's a whole other conversation about the last mile
Yeah.
and the pit hole.
How to get it from 95% to 100%,
Right, exactly,
basically.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so once you were fully up and running and kind of at your peak of publishing, how many stories were you translating per week?
We were we're actually now back around. We'll get to that, but I think we're back around to where we were in the first couple of years, first 2 or 3 years. We were doing about 35 or 40 stories a week.
Okay.
It's like an online magazine.
Hmm.
It's not we're not trying to keep up with all the breaking news. But it's we were turning out a steady flow, keeping up with the news and feeding the beast and all that. And we were syndicating. We had clients who were buying our feed, and so we had to keep them satisfied. And so we were at about 35 or 40 stories a week.
And so eventually the syndication model starts to erode. Why is that?
Well, I think it never really, at least when we got into it, it never was going too far, at least for
Yeah.
us, and I think for others as well. I think It's a model from a previous world, and we made some decent revenue. We had some good paying clients. We were and still are represented by the New York Times Syndicate, which was selling our stuff to their clients. They sell obviously all the New York Times content, but they have about a dozen other sources that they distribute, and they were interested in distributing Worldcrunch. And but it wasn't. We found out fairly quickly that it wasn't going to be enough to keep us fed. And so then at a certain point, as you can imagine, there are priorities, in terms of costs, and return, and what the sort of medium term outlook is telling you. And so we knew we had to pivot in some way. We needed to look for revenue elsewhere, and yeah, and clients, there's there's churn in B2B too. There's churn in syndication, and we lost a couple of clients, but we actually never even really got to the point where it was gonna sustain us enough and allow us to reinvest in the media to then build out our business in other ways.
Yeah, so you eventually pivot and you start focusing on your owned and operated properties instead of syndicating stuff out and making money that way. It's like, how do we get a readership of our own and then start monetizing that directly through that readership? For you kind of shift from a B2B to a B2C model. The problem with syndication is you're not building your own brand. You're not building your own social media accounts very well. You're not building, your own website, like a website or brand affinity and stuff like that. So that kind of forced you to start thinking about, okay, what's the Worldcrunch brand? How do we get people aware of this brand and start, generating revenue from that? So tell me about that. What was the model that you shifted to that where you could start building your own readership and monetizing them directly?
Yeah. Well, actually, there was a bridge, and there still is a bridge that has taken us, because we've been around now for 11 years, and so it took us about 3 or 4 years, also going through the money that we had raised, had to return to our investors. We have very patient, loyal investors.
Hmm.
But my co-founder, Elaine Topokov, and myself have always held on to a majority of the shares of the company. So essentially, we could make the decisions that we thought were the best in the long run. And so when we realized, after about 3 or 4 years, that syndication wasn't going to take us far enough, actually, what we did, because pure B2C at that point didn't look any easier, and it isn't any easier. And so what we did actually, about 5 or 6 years ago, was we started up a sort of branded content operation, which we call Worldcrunch Story Lab, and modeled similarly, although on a much smaller scale. What a lot of other media are doing is taking their know-how and their team and their teams and their place in the market, to do editorial services for clients. And that business, we got that up and running, and was a adventure of its own. But
So
but
you were taking companies were hiring you to basically be like a content marketing agency to use your editorial skills to
exactly.
create content for them, but you weren't necessarily doing anything differentiated that was related to Worldcrunch in the sense of Like it's not like you were translating content for them or anything like that. It was just basically a standard content marketing agency, and you weren't even running the content on the Worldcrunch site. It was just for their own
Right.
sites, right?
Well, the original idea with that was actually we were going to take the Worldcrunch model to clients, and say, you're interested in this vertical. We can translate stories at a low cost, high quality stories. Um, we've done some of that for some clients, but what you find quickly is that when you're doing business development in this world, clients have particular ideas of their own of what they're looking for, and then it's a question if our skills, our general skill set can respond to that. And so you're doing different things, and yeah, not necessarily differentiated globally. Although what our advantage was, most of our clients are here in France, and so we actually are differentiated both by the fact that we're a real editorial. We come with editorial chops and roots, and that we're in English. And
Yeah.
and so we work for big French companies mostly, and other big European companies that also rely on our English, which there aren't so many who are as strong as we are in terms of English in that space. But
Yeah.
in any
But
case,
that model doesn't scale very well
yeah,
because, the whole dream, when BuzzFeed was at its kind of peak, was that this native advertising model would be, the future of media. Suddenly you had every single publisher launching a native advertising,
yeah,
creative studios. And the whole idea was that they would just hand 100% editorial control over to you and trust you. But the reality is, no, there's a lot of hand holding.
yeah.
It's just really hard to scale. The margins are okay, but it's not like you can't scale that business, and that's why BuzzFeed eventually had to start diversifying into a lot of other things.
Yes, I can confirm that all of what you just said, and that leads us up to the present moment, because we know ultimately that the real value in our company, in every sense of the word, in terms of our mission, but also in terms of in the capitalistic sense of the word value, is in being a media, because a media you can scale. And so we're as of a couple of years ago, we're on solid financial ground, and we're reinvesting in our media, and we're building a B2C business with our media. And so we actually had a kind of a parentheses, if you will, where we were continuing to do the journalism on our website, but we took a pause of about 3 years where we said, we're going to build up this other business at the same time, and so we're going to keep doing the journalism, but we're not going to worry about monetizing it.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of money would come in, a bit of the syndication money would come in, but we built up that other business, and now we're back in the jungle of figuring out the business model of media as media.
And so now you're returning back to traditional business models for media. So
Yeah.
it's a mixture of advertising and subscriptions. The advertising, like, do you have like an ad sales staff, or is that just like programmatic, or what's your approach to the advertising side?
Yeah, we're trying to sort of bite off as much as we can on that without we're handling it internally. And yes, programmatic, it's Google, it's Outbrain, and we're testing it out over the past 8 months, sort of seeing what the best way is to monetize it, to maximize it, without going out and selling ads ourselves for the moment. As we're building our audience, once we, as our audience is growing nicely, and when we feel like we're at the right at sort of the right inflection point where it makes sense to. I mean, we do feel like we know we have a valuable global audience, to and start to build out some verticals. We can explore sort of, let's say, investing in getting more advertising dollars out of what we're doing. And we're really focused on us. So we're beginning to tighten our paywall. We've had a
Hmm.
have a meter
So
model, and we're
you have a subscription paywalls. That's the other model.
yeah. So that's
Hmm.
the other model, and that's the one we're putting sort of a bit more sweat and thought into at the moment. And yeah, and we did some studies on pricing and some benchmarking on pricing, and yeah, we feel comfortable with. We've lowered the price from. We had a there was always a way to subscribe to the website since the beginning, but we had a pretty high price and we didn't really pursue it in a serious way. And now we've lowered the price, tightened the paywall, and lowered the meter, and yeah, and selling monthly and yearly subscriptions, and looking to do some marketing and some discounted offers, and doing some partnerships on the distribution, and try to build out our subscriber base.
So you, in order to have successful advertising and especially a successful subscription product, there needs to be brand affinity. There needs to be brand recognition. You need somebody who's like actually a fan of Worldcrunch. So how are you building those habits? Like what product, from social media to newsletters, like how are you building people who are like, yeah, I want to subscribe to Worldcrunch, or I want to advertise with Worldcrunch.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think the double-edged sword of what we've done since the get-go, for anyone who's doing a global general news website, is that you have the potential to find and reach and anyone anywhere in the world. But the downside to that is that you don't have the possibilities both in reader affinity and in advertisers. Um, to It's harder to pull people in, than if you're focused in either on a geographic area, or on a topic vertical. And so, understanding that lesson, we're launching some verticals around topics, and using newsletters. We've over the past 2 years, invested in our sort of daily general, newsletter, morning newsletter, which we make a point, and the Worldcrunch brand and the Worldcrunch mission is really this idea of bringing the whole world a perspective that's different, even if your news source of choice is covering the world, if it's a New York Times or BBC. The New York Times is an American publication with a focus with an American point of view, and that's great. And we obviously can't compete with them on the scale, but we can offer something that's different, that gives a different view of the world, and delivers it and reminds people all the time that there's a whole world out there, and a whole world of news and newspapers and journalists who are covering the world, covering their own countries, looking at other countries, with their point of view. And wouldn't that be interesting for you to be able to tap into that every day in your morning newsletter, while we cover the big stories, but we'll make a point of bringing in articles, bringing in stories that are coming from different places. And so, yeah, so it's we're very aware of that, the the challenge of that branding. And for us, it's also it's a little bit of you kind of have to thread the needle because a big part of who we are the brands, are the news sources that we work with. And they're the original source for a lot of what we do, although we also do write our own stories and are bringing, writing stories off of different pieces being written in different places and connecting the dots and all of that. But, it's also about a great story from La Stampa about the new Italian government, or from we've got a Chinese language partner based in Hong Kong, and getting their perspective on the party Congress that just finished, and so but we have to be smart about it too in terms of around certain topics. We've launched a weekly LGBTQ newsletter that's sort of aggregating across borders and across languages news.
Well, like, are you, for these things, these editorial products, like the newsletters and stuff, are you hiring like a writer to kind of write columns or contextualize it, or is it just like a link roundup? Like, what's the... Like, are you trying to develop a Worldcrunch like voice that, obviously a lot of the content's coming from other outlets, but is there some kind of like worldly voice that Worldcrunch is creating through its own kind of editorial talent?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, that product was launched because one of our colleagues suggested it, and she's taken the lead on it. It takes teamwork though too, because she has 3 or 4 languages, but we'll also want contributions from other languages, and so the team is hunting for content, but then she's shaping it and giving it her voice to some degree. But it's something we're aware of. It's particularly around these specific topics. It's great to have the know-how of a reader, of a writer, journalist who knows about the topic and cares about the topic, then supported by the rest of the team who have other language skills too.
Mm-hmm. So over the last several years, we've seen like remarkable advancements in machine learning and AI. Google Translate has improved by leaps and bounds. And then recently, Google News, they announced that they're going to start translating search results within Google News. And so often now, in the Chrome browser, when I land on an article, it has a little pop-up where I can automatically translate it into English. Given how just in the last year, how much advancement in AI we've seen, does that worry you about like any kind of long-term threat to your business? Like, I know obviously you contextualize things, it's more than just a translation, but for the average news consumer, I mean, what kind of impact do you think will have on your business in the long term?
No, I think, well, we don't want to compete with Google, so but I see it just the opposite. I think it's the sort of light bulb goes on, and it's telling a whole new segment of readers that there are great stories around the world being written in different languages. And it's great advertising for us. What we have to do, obviously, on the one hand, there is providing the context. There is making sure that story. If you could read a whole article, and it's happened to me, where you'll read a whole article in Google Translate, and you feel like you're understanding it the whole way through because the sentences seem coherent, and then you get to the end of the article and you don't know what you just read, and that 5%, and it may be that there's some fact missing. Sometimes we read these in articles where a reporter and an editor miss something, and there's some fundamental thing missing where the article just isn't connecting. And with the machine, if there's something, if one word should be yes and it's no, or black and it should be white, it not only saps the meaning, it inverses the meaning of the article. And so I think so. There's that, but then ultimately, going back to your previous question, it's up to us, and Google doesn't do this, fortunately. At least this they don't do. They don't put it all together into a product and a brand, and so that's our job. And yeah, and so I have to say at the very beginning of this, these questions about Google Translate have been there since we started 11 years ago, and obviously, and actually, as time goes by, and even as it gets better, it's still the more I think about it and the more I've experienced, it's a good thing in and of itself. I'm happy that this technology exists and the world gets connected through this technology. But being a media, being a brand, being something that values people's time and never lets them read an entire story and then get to the end and not know what they've just read. That's our job. And so, Google, worries me for other reasons, but not for that.
Do you have any plans to expand into other mediums like podcasts and video? Like I could see, a good podcast for you where you're kind of just dipping in and interviewing local correspondents to go deeper on the stories you're already publishing, the print versions.
Yeah, we've talked. It's a great idea and one we'd love to pursue. It's a question of bandwidth right now, but yeah, and it's part of the evolution of what we've done. Because when we started, we were very focused on our unique selling proposition, which was we translate stories from one language to another. And over time, we've realized that that's a core differentiation of what we do. But around that, you can do all sorts of things, including writing your own pieces that maybe spin off of something that's being written about in another language. You can do videos. You can do podcasts that exactly that they touch on what sets us apart. And takes advantage of our network, and just generally, gives this is consciously, we're sort of consciously international, and so I think that there's space for a podcast that does that, and yeah, I'll call you up and get your tips when we're ready to launch that.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Well, it's worldcrunch.com. I'm on Twitter, not as active as I should be, at Jeff Israely with a Y at the end. And come visit us at Worldcrunch, and really appreciate appreciate the invitation, Simon.
Awesome. Well, it's a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Have a good one.